So good morning, everyone. I am Jessie Whittish with Kentucky Youth Advocates, and it is great to see all of you this morning, and looking forward to hearing from our panelists as we talk about preparing for the 2021-2022 school year. And I know in some places that school year has already started, so we'll have kicking off the school year in that case. So just a reminder that we are recording today's forum as both a video and a podcast. So if you would please just stay muted, but please feel free to drop questions and comments into the chat, and we'll try to get to those in the remarks, in the questions, or afterwards. And if panelists, if y'all want to answer those, please feel free to do so. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Terry Brooks.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I think every week I begin by thanking all of you for joining us, whether this is your first time or whether you are here for all 61 of these that we've had. So welcome. Dr. Kish Kumi Price, who is KYA's point person on early childhood and K-12, will be helping moderate, not helping, she's actually going to be doing the bulk of the moderation. I am so pleased as we open the school year for Kentucky's kids that we will have spent a couple Wednesdays together thinking about what the 21-22 school year holds. Many of you were on last week's forum, which featured a conversation with Commissioner Jason Glass and Lieutenant Governor Jacqueline Coleman. What we wanted to do was have a part two and have a little bit more of a look from what I would call the ground level, what's really happening in schools. Joining us today are three veterans of these video forums, and we appreciate the authenticity of all three of their voices. Penny Christian is a parent voice for all kids, especially Fayette County kids, and has been so helpful to us, not just thinking about parents, but sort of a kid perspective, especially kids who face special challenges. So Penny, welcome back for a return visit. The other two folks who I know pretty well are Jim Flynn, and Dr. Flynn leads the Kentucky Association of School Superintendents, and Brent McKim, who runs the Jefferson County Teachers Association. And I just need to say publicly that what distinguishes Jim and Brent both is while they certainly represent their constituencies, they are flat out kid-centric leaders. You will not hear a Brent McKim or a Jim Flynn talk about schools without placing kids' interest front and center. And Brent and Jim, I just want you to know that I note and value and savor that leadership quality that both of you bring to the table. So, you know, we're beginning this school year, whether we've just begun or I know many folks on the call are opening next Wednesday. And I'm curious from your different perspectives, Penny as a parent and Brent thinking from a teacher's lens, Jim thinking as superintendent and principal. We enter a year that already has begun marked by ambiguity. And I'm just kind of curious, your best hopes and also your real fear as we enter this school year. And Penny, I think it's probably appropriate that moms and dads across the Commonwealth are sitting with both of those emotions right now. What's that mean? You don't have to speak for every parent in Kentucky, but speak for Penny Christensen. What's your big hope and what's your big worry as this year unfolds?
My big hope is that everything everybody else realized during the pandemic that we already knew is fixed. And when I say fixed, I don't mean there's a magic bullet and ESSER funds are going to fix our problem. When I say fixed, I mean that they are acknowledged, that the gap is real, inequities are real, and it wasn't just because of the pandemic that it happened. So my hope is that schools, educators, administrators, and families will realize that this is a jumping off point and a new opportunity to make things right for babies.
Okay. And what scares you That they don't realize that, or
there you
something
go.
else? Okay.
And that's it. And that's absolutely, and that there's no grace.
Yeah,
And what
that's
do I
such
mean
an
by
important
grace?
element. Yeah.
Because what's going to happen is some of these babies have forgotten how to behave and sit in the classroom. Are we going to have a spike in discipline issues? Are we going to have concerns where the teachers, I can't control these kids, right? And it's not a reflection on the teacher. It's a mindset that we all have to realize they've forgotten. Some of these kids have literally forgotten how to behave. And I don't want to use that as an excuse, because as a parent who will hold their child accountable, that comes into play. But once you get back into that building and then the mass and having fun and my friends, I get to hug you and sit, they're not going to want to just sit still. So that's another fear that I have.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Brent, among the many things that you do, I think especially well, is you're such a great ear. You listen to diverse teacher voices and you're able to synthesize that. What are you hearing from those folks that you represent as they begin a year? What are they excited about and what are they flat out scared about? You're muted. You're muted.
Thank you.
Okay.
Of course, they're excited about getting back in person with their students and having that opportunity to start to build relationships. I think they're excited to be able to teach in some way. One silver lining from what we've been through over the past year is we really revealed the digital divide, and we knew we had to do something about that. And I think we are in a better place than we have ever been. It's not totally, equal or equitable still, but we're much better than we've ever been. I think teachers are excited about being able to engage with some added digital vehicles that they have not had in the past. I've had it, but maybe, they couldn't just assume students had access, or they were not as familiar with platforms. So I think they're excited about that. I think there's a lot of trepidation about what's happening with the COVID numbers and what the implications are. Like, just when it was looking like, okay, we're going to be getting back with every student there every day. And hopefully, that's still the plan. But I think there's a lot of worry that if the numbers keep going up, are we going to be back in some kind of hybrid situation? So that casts a shadow over everything. And hopefully we won't be, but I think there's some anxiety around that.
Yeah. Dr. Flynn, I bet you hear everything from cleaning buses to curriculum from superintendents. So what are you hearing from superintendents and principals and other administrators that you deal with on such a regular basis?
Well, I think, everyone's excited to have an opportunity to get school started. And, but of course, this surge in the Delta variants kind of put a damper on some of that from a superintendent lens, because they're having to deal with, so much uncertainty of, what to do and how to do it. But the exciting thing is that, and I've always, as a superintendent leader, said a community gets the schools it wants. And I think we're in a space where, people have an opportunity to come together and say, hey, we've had this huge disruption to our lives in so many ways, including in our schools and how schools do things. But what a beautiful opportunity to think about the innovations and the things that we can do moving forward that will help kids and help more and more kids, reach their full potential. And I think, we're also operating from a lens of, expanding to think, really about the whole child and not just get kind of sucked into that narrow lens of academics only. That's a big part of what we do. But I think now we're approaching things from a whole child standpoint and looking at their whole well-being. And that's a really positive thing. At the same time, there is so much uncertainty, and superintendents and their teams are trying to figure out, all right, what do we need to do? And one of the other things I think the pandemic has shown us is that a one-size-fits-all solution is generally not the best way to handle things. You know, the local context is so different and so unique in every community, but at the same time, you know, they're looking for good guidance that's grounded in strong evidence and data that'll help them make those decisions at the local level, especially when, you know, the guidance is just that, guidance or recommendations, and they have to figure it out. The big challenge, of course, is the political polarity around all these issues. And no matter what they do, they're going to make a substantial portion of people upset or angry or fearful. And so they're trying to, you know, navigate that, to give people options and to ultimately create the conditions where students can have great learning experiences, regardless of what those options might be in the local district.
Thank you all, the three of you, so much. I would love to probe a little bit more on the whole child approach, but if I did, Dr. Price would get mad because she's going to want to talk about that. So I'm going to ask my final question, and it's going to be a little wonky, but I think it's so important. And Penny, I want you to feel free to jump in, but I know this will especially affect Brent and Jim. I was kind of encouraged last week because I raised the issue with the lieutenant governor and the commissioner that I, for one, was very, very disappointed in the Biden administration's decision last spring to mandate high stakes accountability and assessment. My sense is that teachers and principals and superintendents are committed to that whole child approach. But if we lay on top of them an irrelevant, ill-conceived accountability system this spring, that it's going to be really hard to deliver for kids, that we're going to get into that test game. The lieutenant governor was very public that the Beshear administration had reached out and been highly critical of the Biden decision. Commissioner Glass indicated that he was hoping for flexibility on that. But I'm wondering, just because I think that's a key area as we shape the opening of the school year. If I'm a teacher, I got to know what I'm held responsible for over the course of the year. I'm wondering, Jim and Brent, and again, Penny, from a parent perspective, you feel free to jump in, but I'm wondering if you all could just kind of riff a little bit about the impact of that. And then Kish, that's my last deal. So first of all, I don't know if it scares me or inspires me that we have the same uniform on and didn't plan it, but afterward, you take it from here. So Jim, why don't you open and talk a little bit about your reflections on accountability and assessment?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is really exciting in Kentucky education is a real strong effort in our schools and districts to focus on personalized, deep learning for our students. And back in 1990, when we embarked upon this, school reform effort, those high stakes assessments may have been part of the disruption that we needed to jumpstart the system. But, I would argue now we're in a position of where those are really constraints. They're wrapped around our necks, holding us back from that personalized, deep learning efforts to really think about that whole child. And one of the problems with the high stakes assessment systems, from a state accountability standpoint, is it's a very narrow lens of measure of what we're getting out of there. And it's not as useful, for the student who's the first user of any assessment. Am I learning this, and what do I need to do next in the learning? Or the professional educator who's saying, is my student learning this, and what do I need to do next in instruction? It doesn't really serve that purpose. So it doesn't help that part of the game, but it doesn't help us really, understand how to, prepare students for the workforce, how to prepare them to be a well-rounded contributing citizen, and to live a good, a good life, where they appreciate all aspects of life and develop themselves mind, body, spirit. And so I think, first and foremost, we need to just think about what do we want in a state accountability assessment system, and is that aligned to what our bigger goals are? I heard the commissioner talk about, what people talk about, the purpose of education is. And, unfortunately, that academic development is just one piece that people are interested in, but that ends up being, the major focus. And I think we've learned, especially in this pandemic, that there's a lot of important things that our schools provide, and do these assessment systems hold us back? And certainly we shared that same criticism of the administration's stance to require, the state accountability assessments in a time where we really need to be thinking and focusing on other things. So I agree with you, and I hope maybe we can gain some traction in the policy space to continue to think about this in a different way.
Yeah. Brent?
Yeah, I'll start with the sort of more immediate and then think maybe longer term, bigger picture. Immediately, I first of all, I agree with everything that Jim has said and the concerns you expressed, Terry. I don't think it would be constructive in the environment that we're going to have this year to have the specter of high stakes testing and consequences hanging over everyone, especially when it's tied to really low level basic skills measurements. And as both of you have noted, but I think Jim said it well, in a lot of ways, the high stakes testing was well intentioned, and I think that was an important part of the Kira reform. But when we started Kira, we didn't limit ourselves to just low-level skills assessment. We had portfolios of best work. We had performance events and tasks that were higher order that were part of it. And those things have gone by the wayside, and we're left with sort of the lowest common denominator. And when you have really high stakes on a really low level test that's just at the basic skills level, it tends to drive the systems, the bureaucracies that are school districts down to that lowest level. And that creates an incentive not to have deeper, meaningful, personalized learning experiences, but more like rote teaching and very low level focus. And some people, I think there's a false thought pattern about teaching and learning that says, well, you have to first start with nothing but the basics and master that really well before you can get to something interesting. I think the reality is you need to start with something that is interesting and relevant to the student, that's designed so that the content is built in, where you must learn the content in order to grapple with the interesting question that the learner had some voice in choosing, but the teachers design lesson where they know that, it's managed choice, where there's real choice for a student, but it's still within that appropriate content. And so the price of admission for that interesting conversation about the content is, I've got to learn some of this basic stuff. And they are then intrinsically motivated to do it. And you don't get that if you start from the premise that, you have to learn nothing but the basics and focus on the basics. And then eventually years later, you could get to something interesting that you apply it to. That's just not how human beings are engaged. And we have a real engagement challenge. Like, our students that struggle the most are the ones who are the least engaged. And that's why we need more engaging experiences. And finally, I'll just say, when we started the Kira assessments, they also did multiple years of assessment and created baselines before they ever started talking about consequences. So I certainly hope that if they are going to assess, there could be some general agreement that, you know, there's not going to be high stakes consequences attached to this year or even next year. We're really going to try to reestablish a baseline because we don't know what a baseline even looks like after a global pandemic.
Penny, you have thoughts? My guess is that you're a parent who does not want to hear the reason schools are doing something or not doing something is because of test scores.
First of all, full transparency, I am on Commissioner Glass's committee to address and change the educational system and accountability system in Kentucky. So we've had these discussions and we've had them a lot. Now, as a parent, let me say this, and I'm saying this as a parent of color. I am not completely against assessment, and here's why. Across the country, if you look at the data, if you look at where the gaps are biggest, it's where you have inefficient accountability and assessment. So what assessment does for kids who are our most challenged groups, it identifies them. Otherwise, they can't hide as well, right? So what do I want to see in an assessment? We're talking about formative versus summative, right? If you have a summative assessment situation right now, no problem. But one thing I said in these meetings with the commissioner in this committee is we need to pivot. We need to change some verbiage. And we need to acknowledge that the only accountability that's happening with these tests in this whole process is the kids, right? They're being held accountable. So what does accountability look like? And should we change it to consequences versus accountability? We have to assess. We have to know where these babies are, or else we can't help them. So I don't have a problem with assessment. What I do want is for teachers to, yes, have the freedom to not just teach to, I don't think, at least with my kids, I don't think that they taught to the test. I don't believe that. And I think the majority of teachers in Kentucky did not teach to the test. But when they hear high stakes testing, I think that's a phrase we need to stop using as well. We automatically think, oh God, they're going to come and get me. They're going to blame the teacher. They're going to blame the principal, and the teachers everyone blames everyone else. So my hope moving forward, and yes, I do believe we should assess this year. What does that look like? I don't know. Because almost every big district, even some of the smaller ones, did some sort of summer something using this new influx of funds to see where the babies are. But even when we said I was up in Fayette County, I said, you have to have assessment at the end. You have to have something culminating to know exactly. It's not about learning loss. We call it unfinished learning, right? So where do we meet them? And how do we meet them? And I think that we have to have assessment in order to do that properly.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Price, take it from here.
Thank you much. I'm excited to have this conversation. I'm literally thinking like where to begin. I have a list of questions. You guys saw them, but you have brought up so many excellent points. I guess I will start with maybe talking through a little bit about what transpired this past year. And to be frank, I think for the first time, a lot of parents and family members, community partners, folks that were helping students along the process, for many of the students who had to learn remotely, were surprised by the academic levels of some of the students that they were working with. Surprised that they were having a really difficult time helping them to understand concepts when it seemed like very basic elements were missing, like how to read. So I'm wondering, with that new knowledge that we know, a lot of folks have, what are your thoughts around how we get to that place of addressing what Penny just highlighted, where folks can see this is where a student is, and this is how we need to help this student move forward? Because I think what I'm hearing, nationally and just in conversations daily about this, is that we've been on this hamster wheel of doing the same thing over and over again. Maybe we change a little something, but we haven't really gotten to the point where we know where a student is and we're able to help move that student along in robust ways within the classroom, right? Like everybody's moving. And so we have the high achieving students and their parents are upset because that, whatever we want to call it, teaching to the middle or teaching to the test, they're not getting what they're expecting to have in this experience. Then we have the students who are struggling and they're not getting what they need. So what do we need to do to change that? Like I'm not even talking about the assessment piece necessarily. I'm just talking about meeting the need. Where does that begin? And I think it makes sense for us to highlight the fact that we won't even know where a student is if we don't assess, right? So we know that we're talking about some form of assessment needs to take place, but how do we begin to address like those individual needs and move forward collectively? Penny.
I'm going back to the committee, Dr. Glass's committee. In the first meeting, his charge to us, well, he thanked us all for bringing whatever lens we brought, but the first thing he told us, change your lens. He said, don't do this work strictly through your lens. Because if you don't stay there, you can see how this impacts educators. You can see how this impacts the group of kids you may not necessarily always be fighting for. You can see how it impacts superintendents. He said, change your lens, take off the one that you have. And that automatically brings in what? Empathy. You take that empathy and you can't help but address the equity component, right? Because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about equity and empathy. So I'm going to say what Dr. Glass said. Change your lens. Take off the one. If you're a special needs parent, take that one off and understand that you should be fighting for every baby. Because guess what? If your baby is not getting something, another kid is not getting something.
Exactly. That's good. Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in here? Brent, I think you're.
Yeah, let me jump in, and I want to also say something about assessment. I think no one's saying that there shouldn't be assessment for judging where students are and where they need to be. I think what I'm trying to communicate, and I believe what Jim was as well, is when you place really high stakes on a cheap multiple choice state administered test, yes, you get some information from that, but you also get a whole lot of unintended consequences that typically for students who are low income or students of color, the effect of that is in those schools, they get a diminished experience that focuses just on the teaching to the test because there's such high stakes. Whereas we could be thinking in terms of an assessment not being about one-time assessment that's multiple choice from the state, but the state's role could be in assuring with higher ed partners that every classroom educator can design and score assessments reliably with at least as good, if not better, inter-rater reliability than a multiple choice test. And then we empower the educators to actually do the assessment, and they can demonstrate that they can design and score those accurately. And then that data could be used for accountability purposes. And then that lets you assess what we're talking about in this question, which is the individual issues with each student, and to actually have the ability to diagnose misunderstandings or barriers or roadblocks to learning, kind of deconstruct what is it that's at the root of why this particular student's struggling on whatever the issue may be or the topic, and then have a way to share that and communicate that with parents or to plug the student into the right kind of resources to help with what you've diagnosed the issue or problem to be. So I think when there are learning problems or students are just not getting it, you have to be able, teachers need the capacity to diagnose like a doctor does and identify what are the specific issues that are barriers and what works then. What do you, once you've diagnosed like a doctor, what do you prescribe in order to address that you know works when you have information about what's really the barrier or the challenge.
Absolutely. Dr. Flynn, you want to add to
Yeah,
that?
I mean, this is an interesting, question to think about, and as we kind of keep on kind of wrapping around to this assessment, I'll affirm that, as educators, we're not opposed to assessments, we're not opposed to accountability, but again, kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier, we know a one size fits all solution is not what's needed, even down to the individual child experience. And and to kind of build on what Penny was saying, if we keep on doing things the same way, we're going to continue to get the same kinds of results. And I think we can all agree that the current system has not worked, well for every single child. And so I think, the beautiful opportunity, and when I hear the commissioner talk about, creating experiences for kids, when I was a superintendent, I used to challenge our team to, I would say, how is this effort, whatever it is, whatever we're doing, going to impact the student experience as a result of their education here in our schools, in our district? And, and we've got to have that mindset, because ultimately it comes down to, to them. And so we need to examine the whole system, because I think people have recognized that for many kids, the in-person services and learning is so important. I think many parents, and my wife's a teacher, and for example, she would get these calls from parents like, I can't get him to do anything. How do you, so I think there is an understanding of of the importance of the professional educator and a well-trained educator who can lead this work in our classrooms and in our schools and districts. And and ultimately, it is a people business. And when we think about how do we move that's an adaptive challenge. That is is going to take a different kind of leadership to move it. But there's a lot of things that I think we can do. And one is to really examine the policies that we have in place that are contributing to the results we're getting, and the persistence of those gaps, and the persistence of the failure for the current system to do what we aspire for it to do for all children, and to really think about what are those drivers that should be driving this compared to what we have now, and then what are the associated policies that'll help us create the kinds of systems and ultimately the kinds of experience we know that'll take a child where they need to be. And that's what I think that's why we come back to sometimes the state assessment systems, is because they're having too much influence on what happens with our kids because of the enormous pressure that they place on schools to meet those aspects of the accountability. And that doesn't always allow us to do what we know a child needs to meet them where they are and move them. And so it gets into that. Should the assessment be the driver, or is it the standards? And ultimately, we know it's the student experience that's going to matter to that child. And so I think we need to heed the commissioner's advice and take off our lenses and get out of our echo chambers and really hear all those voices, including those unusual voices that haven't always been at the table to help us navigate the next path.
And one more thing that I would add is one thing that we experienced over the past year was it became clear that the virtual learning experience just wasn't working for every student. Some actually maybe worked better than what they had been experiencing, but for many it did not. And in response to that, at least in Jefferson County, many community partners across the county stepped up and created learning hubs or pods or whatever you'd like to call them to help the kids that were really struggling with the NTI kind of approach. And that was above and beyond the normal like school day, that they were getting the support, and kids were coming in small numbers because of social distancing and everything. Well, research tells you one of the most effective practices for students that are struggling is high intensity tutoring with very small numbers, like one-on-one or very small groups, that happens at least 2 or 3 times a week. And we were kind of having that with these learning hubs and pods and what have you. And there's, I think, hopefully, one of my aspirations is that the community is recognizing that we kind of created an infrastructure that we've needed for decades and didn't exist. And now the question is, how can we sustain and keep that infrastructure where students have the access to pretty intense, really small group tutoring opportunities that really do impact their learning. And I hope we'll be able to find ways as a community to sustain that and keep that going, because we've needed that for a long time. And so we do have kind of an opportunity with that.
Absolutely. I'm glad you added that piece, because that is really where I wanted to go, is thinking through, now that we have this new way of connecting with families and community partners, how do we keep that energy and increase it as we move back into schools full time? I will say, I guess one of my hopes is shared with yours, Brent, that we're going to see more of that. But I would say my fear is that we're going to go back and revert to the norm of, having those 4 different types of family and school partnerships, where many of our schools are fortress schools, where it's like, we got this. You got them at home, we got them here. Thanks. So what would you all recommend in terms of really bolstering those relationships in a way that matters for our students so that they can get that individual attention?
Well, I would say, first, we should not be thinking in terms of getting back to normal, because the normal we had before the pandemic was not working for far too many students. So we may casually say get back to normal in terms of, okay, every student every day. And we all want that, I believe. But we don't want the same normal we had before. So that's one thing, that's not good enough. And this is an opportunity to do something better. And second, I think we should be thinking about what we can do that's sustainable with the one-time. We have a significant amount of one-time COVID relief funding from the ARP, the ESSER 1, the ESSER 2, and the ESSER 3 funds. And how can we, maybe there are some, for example, with regard to the high intensity tutoring, maybe we need it's an opportunity to create a regional center where it's able to service a number of schools near it. And you have a whole second, when the regular school day ends and the school closes, in that regional area, there's an easily accessible physical location that we staff. And that day begins when the regular school day ends, and there's always a certified professional educator in all the subjects there to support students and so forth. So we may have some opportunities with being strategic about not just investing in the ESSER funds in programs, but also investing in a way that is sustainable going forward.
And Kishal, to kind of build on that, one of the kind of privileges I have in my role is I get to talk to superintendents and education leaders from across the state. And the one thing that I want to emphasize is that, each community is so unique in terms of that local context and what kind of community assets they have, and how they can bring people together to kind of, galvanize around that, that mantra of a community gets the schools it wants. And if it wants great schools, then, get involved, have high expectations, invest time and resources, to make it happen. And so I think with that money that, that Brent was just talking about, every school district's trying to find ways, okay, how do we use this to, to build the systems and supports, and to engage the people in that. And kind of one of the neat things in a lot of communities, they've done things like there's a group that does those parent camps, for example, to, engage the parent voices in that part and of the work. And then some of these other community agencies and that are now, really important partners, and we're building on that. And not just thinking about the academic supports, but we're thinking about, the physical health and well-being and the socioemotional and behavioral health and the safety and all of those things working together in a way that helps nurture that whole child and their, advancing their well-being and ultimately, kind of meeting all those different purposes. And so, going back to what Brent says, I think, we really need to think, how do we sustain that? We've got money here for the next 3 years that's going to provide some really needed supports and hopefully change the student experiences in our schools for the better. But how do we sustain that long term is something we're going to have to grapple with and figure out.
So Manny Kalk, when he was superintendent, he set up a committee, CPLT. And CPLT was designed to bridge and liaise with community families in schools. And one thing he always told us was, he used the 17-7 formula. He said, we have your kids for 7 hours every day. You have them for 17. Which one do you think impacts these babies more, right? And the first thing he talked about was understand that 85 to 90% of the issues the babies are having in the building started outside the building, right? Is there a poverty issue, right? What's their home life like? What's their neighborhood like? All of these things impact what happens inside the classroom. So this is why he said we've got to have that community aspect. Understand that if you don't bring in the community so that you can provide those resources and identify these concerns, these are nothing but barriers. How do we mitigate this damage, right? And in terms of what Brent said, high intensity tutoring is proven. And here I am on another committee. Fayette County is looking into doing just that when school opens. We even talked about utilizing, there's one program, one model across the country that uses 2-hour blocks during the course of the school day, right? So how does that, we're mitigating, we're eliminating more barriers, right? If there's a transportation issue, or if they have to be home by a certain time, if it happens during the school day, right? So, and I believe in high intensity tutoring. I also believe that the training has to be there.
Yeah.
Right? You can't just say, hey, teacher, you want to make some extra money? No, because this is not ESS.
Right.
This is high intensity tutoring, and it's designed to show results, and it's measurable results. So bringing in the community means acknowledging that 17-7 and bringing in and being innovative, and be it high intensity learning or changing how you do the school day with the understanding that you cannot do this in a vacuum in those fortress schools, right, Kish?
That's it. That's it. And I'm wondering, because, looking at the statistics for Kentucky, we are clearly not a diverse, teacher workforce. We do not have a diverse teacher workforce. And I'm wondering if folks have explored the thought of having more community presence and trying to kind of fill the gap of diversity in the schools by bringing in community partners to assist with some of these measures that we're talking about. I think that can be transformative. And I'm really wanting to bring up that conversation we were talking about with deeper learning and You know, is it really fair that our kids don't get to explore what they're interested in, that gap in engagement is because they could give a flip about what the teacher's talking about and the teacher hasn't found a way to connect with the student, and the teacher feels the pressure of trying to do that, thinking, well, I got to do this because this is what I'm being measured by, but not really understanding that if you can get to the heart of that child, every child in your class, your job is going to be that much easier. If you can get to whoever is connected in their system and have a working relationship and build those bridges, your job's going to be that much easier. But I don't think the training has been that. My next question is just around, how do we support educators in building those bridges? Like, how do we help that process? Because I'm also quite aware that you can say whatever you want to say at the district level, but it really just depends on the leadership at the particular school, the SBDM councils, to make those changes and implement it in the ways that, you know, we would hope for. So what are your thoughts around how we can do that? How can we build those bridges and support our educators and families in doing so?
Well, education's a people business, and it's all about the leadership and instructional capacity of our people that are serving in our schools. Specifically, you know, the teacher, because when the classroom door shuts, they're the leader of that classroom, and so their leadership capacity, their instructional capacity, are what matter. You know, we know there's not a great school that has excellence across the board without a strong principal leader. And so, you know, their leadership capacity and ability to be a leader of leaders and develop, you know, their people, be capacity builders is key to that school. And then, you know, principals, will thrive under the leadership of an effective superintendent. And an effective superintendent's going to thrive when they have a strong school board who's focused on the right things. And then that ought to be a reflection of the community, which goes back to that, you know, my opening line of a community gets the school it wants. So that's how it ought to work. But, I go back to, we know what high quality professionals want and need to do their work, but do we deliver on that? You know, do they know what's expected of them? Do they get to do what they're best at and what they're trained to do? Do they have the tools and resources to do it? Do they have opportunities to learn and grow? Do they get feedback on their work? You know, do they have, mentors and coaches that can help them? You know, we know those kinds of things, but do we have the policies in place, and have we created the conditions for that to happen? You know, I contend that we have too many policies that inspire compliance versus, policy initiatives that would inspire engagement and a growth mindset. And that, I think that's where we have to shift. And I can give you some examples if you want to dive into that, but I think fundamentally, that's how we have to, start thinking, what do these people know and needed to be able to do, and in order to deliver on that, and that's kind of where we are. We know that teachers are experts in instruction, but we ask them to be counselors and therapists and social workers and nurses and police investigators, and the list can go on and on. And so we need to, those things are all important, but we need to let teachers be best at what they're trained to do. And too often our policies and our resources don't deliver on that.
Tish, you preached a word about SBDM. And I understand its importance, and especially when it comes to parent voice with SBDM. But when we ask the question, and we consistently ask this question, why aren't teachers of color being hired? It's not at the district level. It's at the school level where they're not even being granted interviews, right? That's an SBDM issue. That's a building leadership issue. That said, we are pushing now for every teacher ed program, every college to have an embedded family engagement protocol, not a 3-hour PD, build it into your curriculum for being a teacher. And we're also asking that you talk about culturally responsive teaching. at training level. Now, what does that mean for your administrators? Not much. So how do we hold them accountable? Because you can come in and be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I'm so excited I get to implement all this new stuff. And you have a principal who goes, no, we don't need to focus on that. So Dr. Jim Flynn is right when it comes to the building leadership. If that leader, if that administrator does not want it, if that administrator is not encouraging or modeling it, that's where you're going to have that block.
And I will say, part of the question was having really authentically personalized learning experiences that are relevant to each learner. And that can really only happen if the educators at the school are very intentional and have a lot of capacity building that have given them the ability to be strategic about how they make that happen. It doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of work and practice and support to do that. And I agree, building principles are really important to that and the culture they create. One way that you can, it's really a paradigm shift because it's about teaching students, not teaching content. The content is important, don't get me wrong, but it's about connecting with the student and doing the hard work of relating the content to the student in a way that really invites the student to engage with it. We have right now going on in Jefferson County, we've had yesterday, the past 3 days and culminating today, a deeper learning symposium where we've brought in really inspirational educators from across the country to focus on deeper and more engaging and much more personalized ways of learning. And we're having breakout sessions with principals and teachers about how you do this, how you give students voice and have real meaningful choice for students. It doesn't mean they just get to pick whatever they learn, but they have meaningful choice to choose sort of managed choice to choose something that really means something to them, that engages them. And that's the key. There's a lot of professional development that's needed and a lot of support from administrators, from the superintendent saying, this is our theory of action, all the way down to the building principal, to the classroom to make that happen.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, all of you, for your rich comments. And I wish we could have a part 3, part 4, part 5, because I know you have I have so many more questions, but thank you so much. And I hope and pray that your hopes for this year actually come to fruition, that my hopes come to fruition, that every parent's hopes come to fruition, and that we can curb these fears as we go forward. So I'm gonna check in. Terry, did you want to close? Okay, so I'm kicking it to Jessie. Thank you so much, everybody.
Everyone, thank you to Penny and Brent and Jim for all of your insight today. As many of you know, I am about to be the mom of a public school kid for the very first time. So my son is starting kindergarten in a week, and so I might have been crying in all of my staff meetings all week, but that's okay. My coworkers are really understanding of that, so any tips, let me know. But you know, so I think it's really great to hear from all of you and your different perspectives about what, you know, that kind of leadership of a teacher, that leadership of a principal, that leadership of families and kids, you know, and I think as a parent, part of my hope is that that teacher is, you know, like providing instruction, but frankly is also a social worker and is also, you know, knows how to deal with discipline in a way, and you know, does wear all of these hats. You know, those teachers are that first line of affection and education for our kids. So my hope is that they do wear all those hats and they get the support that they need while they are doing that, because teachers are incredible and what we need for that, real family engagement, and that all the other district employees have that as well. So again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees. Thank you to everyone who's going to hold my hand next week while I'm crying as my son starts kindergarten. And thank you to Aetna Better Health of Kentucky for sponsoring today's forum and all of our advocate virtual forums. Next week, we will be talking about adverse childhood experiences and adverse childhood environments, the pair of ACEs, if you will, and a new statewide initiative to kind of move upstream in addressing those ACEs. And then the following week, on August 18th, we will continue the conversation about ACEs, and we will be talking with legislators about some state policy and budget opportunities to begin to address those. So thank you all so much, and hope to see you next week. You won't see me next week. I'll be huddled in a corner crying. But you'll see others on here next week, and but I'll see you weeks after that. So thank you
Jesse.
all.
Thanks, Kish. Thanks, Terry.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
It'll be good.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that reassurance. Bye, everyone.
It'll be